Hello, my name is Martha Payson Ryman. I'm here in the Epley Auditorium on the campus of Culver Academies, sitting beside the Arts and Letters Hall of Fame wall. And here on my right is my father's, a tribute to my father, which was given to him 38 years after he retired from his job of 41 years as band director at the Academy. It was an absolutely wonderful occasion, and we had luncheon in the mess hall, and each relative or inductee was given a chance to get up and talk. Here's a picture of my daughter Emily with me. Unfortunately, at that time, I had a terrible case of laryngitis and couldn't say a word, so Emily spoke from some notes that I had written out. So I'm happy to have a chance now to sit here by Daddy's picture and this little memorial to him in this wonderful building that he helped to dedicate by conducting the first show that was given here, Oklahoma, by Richard Rogers and Oscar Hammerstein. And my husband and all three of my my two older daughters, my husband and I were here for that occasion. When I had a chance to speak at the inductees luncheon, I jokingly told Kathy Zerberg, the girl in charge, that I'd like about 30 minutes to talk about my dad, and then I would take questions for maybe 10 or 20 minutes, which was just a riot because there were a lot of people, and I was joking, but so many people have stories to tell about encounters they had with my dad and things that went on. There are just so many Edward Payson stories floating around that I think someday I'll write a little compendium of those. But one of the things, I'll read from my notes that Emily read from at the induction ceremony. For one thing, he's the only inductee who was a Culver alumnus of summer and winter school, and as well as a faculty member. He was the only one of all these inductees who was a graduate of summer school and winter school, as well as being a faculty member. When he graduated from Culver Winter School in 1922, two of the other inductees, Charles C. Mather and William O'Callahan, were already on the faculty and had been his teachers when he was in school, of course. And then also Jim Bishop was on the faculty then, and also my grandfather, George Eisenhard, his future father-in-law, was on the faculty and had been his teachers. And also Lee Robinson Ginolette was superintendent at the time, as well as James Henderson's father, John Henderson, was on the faculty when my dad was a cadet. And the circumstances of him coming to Culver are kind of interesting. He was sent here to be prepared for Harvard, and he had already graduated from high school in Alexandria, Indiana, and it was at the time not unusual for Culver to be a preparatory school, as they called it then, for young men that wanted to get into Ivy League schools. And the word I got was that he'd been something of a disciplinary problem in his hometown of Alexandria, Indiana. But then I also heard that people in the neighborhood said, "Edward, military school? He's not a bad boy. Why are they sending him to military school?" Well, his sister Evelyn lived in New Jersey, so I didn't have much chance to pump her about Edward's early escapades and why he was sent to military school. But when I did talked with her about it, she gave it some serious thought. And she said, no, Edward was never a problem. She said, Dad, that was their father, who was a band director and music teacher, exploited Edward because Edward was a musical genius. And every time there was a concert, he'd have Edward play a solo. And every time guests came to the house, he would call Edward down from his room or in from the barn or wherever he was and have him play a solo for the guests. And Edward rebelled at that by sitting in the front parlor in front of guests in order to play, squawking his clarinet as loud as he could to horrify his father. And another factor was that his mother died when he was 16. She died in their living room, fully clothed, sitting in her rocker, with the doctor standing beside them and the whole family around. And as far as I could figure out, it must have been some kind of an embolism or a sudden heart attack or something, because she had not been a sick person. He had worked his mother, and that was quite a lot of trauma for him. And his grandmother came out from Massachusetts to run the house and take care of the family. And then it was decided that he would come to school up here, and I think that decision coincided with the fact that his father wanted to remarry a young woman that lived either next door or just 2 doors down, and she was quite a bit younger. Well, you know, for teenagers, that's awfully hard to take, especially when they're still grieving for their mother. So my dad got a scholarship to Culver and came up here for the start of school in September. I believe that would have been 1920 in September. And got a scholarship, and one of his jobs here was to be the bugler. And they bugled everything then. They bugled reveille, and they bugled breakfast, and they bugled class periods, and they bugled morning for lunch, and then they bugled lunch, and then they bugled form up for lunch and march into lunch. Well, he was just really running flat out all day. And I noticed in the movie Tom Brown of Culver, there's a shot where the bugler is standing on the roof of Main Barracks blowing into a big leather megaphone. That was leather. And my dad said that he had done that. That's where he not only had to do all this bugling, in addition to his class work and sports, had to run up the steps to the roof of Main Barracks to do all this bugling. And it's pretty much fun in the Army or in the service and at Culver at the time to hate the bugler, because it meant get up or go in or whatever, it was so there are jokes in his yearbook about him having been the bugler. Now, when he was in school, also, smoking was an expellable offense. Any cadet caught smoking was expelled. So after he graduated in 1922, he and another boy stayed over a few days in June to take college board examinations. They had civvies to wear, and they walked downtown, and they went to the drugstore and bought cigarettes, and they walked around town smoking, feeling like big shots. His words, big shots. He said, we felt like big shots over there in civvies, smoking. And that was the beginning of a long life of smoking. And as you know, probably most people who remember him know that his nickname was Nicotine Ed, or Old Nick, and that he was never without a cigarette. And he did smoke for the rest of his life. In fact, he was even smoking in the hospital during his final illness, but then did finally cut it out a few days before he died. Well, he married he went to Harvard after he graduated, came back to Culver to be on the staff as a tactical officer and assistant to Major O'Callahan. He taught music and helped the band march, taught them to march, line up and all that stuff. And he met my mother because he had taken her sister, Billy, to a movie. And Billy brought him home for some pie and coffee or something after the movie and introduced him to her sister, Dorothy, who played the piano. And she knew that my dad was a cellist, and she said, now you two should get together. So they did. And they played constantly for WCMA. And they both loved doing that. And they played all kinds of classical music and operetta music for the radio station. And they were married in the Ginolette House, which was a Swiss chalet by the lake on June 11th, 1927. And that's how I got my Culver background. That's how I happened to grow up in Culver. My friends and relatives around the country used to think that I was very lucky to grow up on the campus of a boys' school. And they all desired to come and visit me and have me get them dates. And somehow I found that rather intensely boring. And they thought, oh, but to be around all those boys, and you must really know a lot about men. I mean, to live right on the campus of a boys' school. There were no girls in school then. But I can say that I did not pick up much information about men from growing up on the campus of a military school. All the boys I knew dressed alike, did the same things, and smelled like shoe polish. So, I'll turn that off now. I got lost my... It's been a wonderful experience to be back at Culver and meet people who knew my father and have an opportunity to talk about him. And this is the program from the induction ceremony, the induction weekend. The Arts and Letters luncheon was in the mess hall on November 6, 2004. And all these other people shown here, except the ones who are deceased, were there and talked. It was just a marvelous experience, and it was a wonderful thing to do. And I think the emphasis on arts at Culver has multiplied 1,000 times since my dad came here. When he came here, they had the bugling, they had the band and the marching band, and I think sometimes they had band concerts. They did have band concerts, and now there's so much available for the students and all these wonderful facilities in this auditorium. And I understand that there's planning for a new music and arts building, and that's really something wonderful to look forward to. Okay. I would like to say that my grandmother, Cynthia Weil Eisenhard, was extremely interested in education, and as her husband was, and they were both teachers. In fact, she had been a teacher in Ohio before she moved to Culver. One day, she was serving lunch to her family, and they were sitting around the table, I think at the house at 117 West Madison. My mother, who was about 11 or 12 at the time, wasn't eating her lunch. Cynthia said, "What's the matter, Dorothy? Eat your lunch. You've got to get back to school." And Dorothy put her head down. Big tears rolled down her cheeks. She was crying. Everything came to a halt. "What is the matter, Dorothy?" And Mother proceeded to tell her about what their morning at school had been like. There was a boy in her class, and I suppose these people were in about 6th grade. There was a boy in the class from out in the country who had a cleft palate and possibly a hare lip, badly deformed mouth. The school teacher, a man, had forced that child to stand in front of the class and try to recite the Gettysburg Address. and had forced him to stand there in front of the class for hours while the class sat there, because they knew they wouldn't move on to the next lesson until that boy recited the Gettysburg Address. He was unable to speak because of his deformity, but required to go to school by law. Mother said she saw her mother. This story I'm telling was told to me by my mother. Her mother put on her hat, because ladies then didn't go out without hats. Maybe they were, right from the laundry room or the kitchen or whatever, but they always wore a hat when they went out. Marched right up this main street of Culver to the school, which I think was down in there. I'm pointing now toward the lake. This is Jefferson Street. It was on South Jefferson, I think, down in that area. Marched down there and raised quite a ruckus. And then immediately organized all the other mothers into a group, and it was not called PTA then, but it was the forerunner of the PTA. She organized the group of mothers who would just unannounced and unexpected drop into the classroom and sit there in their hats, over in the corner, watching what was going on. And so that effort of hers against any kind of social injustice, and especially toward children, which she felt very strongly about any harm being done to children, was the start of the PTA in Culver. And now we just take it for granted that a teacher isn't going to be cruel to a student, but every now and then, something slips through. But her vigilance really helped get that started in Culver, and I'm sure saved a lot of strife in the school, because if that teacher was doing that to that little boy in such a cruel and inhuman way, I'm sure there were other things going on.
Do we know anything about the specifics of that teacher, what happened?
I don't know for sure. I think he was fired. Now, I don't know if I hope he was. There was a student mother's class, a man named Franklin McLean, who went all through school with Mother, and he later became superintendent of the Culver High School. Mm. And maybe you have something in the library about him. He was a fine person and well-liked and did a good job. But he would have been going through school at the time that kind of, torture was going on. It was more than just corporal punishment. When I was in school, the principal, Floyd M. Annis, had the power to whip students. And so beatings being sent to the principal's office, even in the 40s, the early 1940s, was not uncommon, and you'd hear the whipping. You could hear it all over the school. But that was done by the principal. No punishment was meted out in the classroom. And I don't know if any of that's documented in the Culver Citizen or not. It would be fun to find out. And maybe the ladies had meetings about they must have had a rota, like, Cynthia, it's your turn to visit school this week, or, Mabel, it's your turn to visit.
What year approximate year do you think that was?
Probably about the year that this costume ball picture was taken, about 1913, 1912, or 1913. Judging by the age of my mother in the picture, because she did all her schooling here in Culver, and I believe that she was about 12 in that picture, maybe.
And which one is your mother?
She's the one with the X on her.
Oh.
In the lower right-hand corner, sitting on the floor. That's my mother, Dorothy Eisenhard Payson.
Okay.
And so I was always proud of my grandmother. I never heard her tell that story, and no one told me about it, but someone else in town, one of my teachers, I think, said, "Oh, your grandmother was a great supporter of the school and did a lot to help the school." Where was I? Okay, I talked about my grandmother, Cynthia. I wanted to put in a good word for her, in addition to what we already have about my grandmother and her cooking and her church work and her gardening and all the things she did. she was a civic-minded person and cared for the community and for children, too. And my grandfather, Eisenhard, was due to retire from the head of the science department at the Academy in 1929, but he stayed on till 1930 for some reason. That appears that maybe they hadn't gotten a replacement for him. I'm not sure. And so the crossover in my family that's interesting is that my father was moving into the Culver community about that time. He had graduated from the Academy in 1922 in the winter school. And as so often happens, some family crisis does something that affects destiny for years to come. His mother died when he was in high school, and apparently, as far as I know, it might have been an abdominal aneurysm. He said that she sat down in her rocking chair, fully clothed, in their living room, was in great discomfort. The family doctor was called. He just stood there. He could do nothing, and she died in their living room in her rocking chair, and he witnessed that. And he must have been about 16 at the time, and he was devoted to her. And that made it very hard. His grandmother came out from New England, took care of the family, and he was going to high school, and became kind of a problem. And one time I had to pump his sister to find out what it was Edward had done that was a problem. I couldn't imagine my father being a bad boy in town, or doing anything so terrible that he would have to be sent off to military school. Well, Aunt Evelyn told me that Edward was not a bad boy, that he was rebellious, and he was being pressured by his father to perform because he was a musical prodigy, played all instruments, and his father would bring strangers or people he did business with or anybody he knew into the house, and he'd call Edward down from whatever he was doing, homework or whatever, to come into the front parlor and play. So I guess just a couple of times Edward went into the front parlor with his clarinet, got out his music, and squawked that clarinet loud enough to make the roof go off the house. Bad boy. So he did not want to be exploited. That was obvious. And then his father decided, and possibly his father's interest in a young woman who lived next door, who was quite a bit younger, not as young as his own children, but maybe quite a bit younger than his mother had been. His father was interested in the girl named Mabel. So Daddy was sent up to Culver Summer School, and then his teacher was my grandfather, Eisenhard. So my father had his future father-in-law as a science teacher when he was here, and quite a few of the people who later became his peers on the faculty were teaching here at the time he was a cadet. Jim Bishop was on the faculty as a history teacher. Of course, General Genelak was superintendent, and quite a few people were here at that time. And then my father was always interested. My father was hired in the summertime to be an assistant to Colonel Callahan with the band. And my father had been going to Harvard, had gone there for 3 years, and some streak of rebelliousness came over him at that time. And it also coincided with the financial reverses that my grandfather had. He was band director and music teacher and music master in a small town whose major industry was a glass factory that made glass globes for lanterns. Well, electricity came in. Automobiles were taking over every mode of transportation. People didn't have horse and buggies and wagons anymore. People had electricity in their homes, and they didn't need globes for their gas lamps or their kerosene lamps or their gas lamps on the wall. So there wasn't money in the town for music. That's one of the first things to go, any kind of culture, when money is scarce. And then also there was a stock market crisis. My grandfather, Payson, a thrifty New Englander, had always saved and invested his money in something called Strauss bonds, which were not protected in any way from theft, fraud, whatever. So he lost a great deal of money in that stock market thing and didn't have money to continue my father's education. So after Daddy had spent the summer here as assistant band director, then he was told he could stay on in the winter as assistant. And I have his contract for that. I have all his contracts with the Academy. And meanwhile, the Eisenhards had moved to a house over on North Terrace. It's on North Terrace now. It wasn't there originally. They moved a bunch of houses around over there. But Mother's sister, Wilma Louise, was working in the QM store, quartermaster store at the Academy, and my dad met her and asked her for a date. They went to a movie, and she brought him home. And she said, come on back to the house. We'll have cake and coffee. You can meet my sister. She plays the piano. And so that's how my mother and Dad met, because Mother had taken lessons from Elizabeth Hubble, was a very, very good pianist. And my dad just was thrilled because he was a very fine cellist. And I have this picture of him dated summer 1926. So you can see that that's how he looked at about the time that he met Mother. And they hit it off, and they were married in 1927 in June in the Ginlet house, the Swiss chalet by the lake. There was no really place else to get married then, and Mrs. Ginlet told them they could have the wedding there. And then they lived at the New Culver Hotel for a while. That has been torn down now. But I have this little piece of scratch paper I found with Mother's writing on it, a little poem that she didn't write the poem, but it was something she liked to recite nonsense and, the guy that wrote all this nonsense.
Lewis Carroll?
Lewis Carroll, yeah.
Was Brilligan the
all the
sliding
Brilligan, she could memorize all that. Maybe because she was a good pianist, she had that ability in her brain to memorize all those black notes on a page of paper. She could memorize nonsense poetry that didn't mean a thing, but she could recite that by the yard.
Was the New Culver Hotel, that wasn't the Culver Inn?
No,
No.
it was right over here on the corner. There's a farmer's market there now.
Osborne Hotel
Yeah.
for a while.
Right.
Okay.
And Daddy always chuckled because he said that when he came here as a cadet, that was called the New Culver Hotel. And it had been called
do you mind if I-
New Culver Hotel until it was torn down in the 40s. And we had rooms there on the front, and it was very comfortable. And then my grandfather retired, and I have this picture to show you of him retiring from the Academy. And he and my grandmother and their two daughters were just wonderful to me and made a kind of a pet out of me, as I was the first grandchild. And so I had a nice beginning here in Culver with relatives and friends around. And then my grandfather's health was failing. I'm not sure, of course, I think it might have been from some of the compounds in his laboratory. People then were not aware of the danger of mercury and other chemicals that he undoubtedly used in his laboratory. I know that he wasn't aware of the danger of mercury because Mother said he used to bring it home. He'd bring little experiments home for his kids and set them up. And so his health started to deteriorate, I think even before he retired. And then he was diagnosed with something called palsy, but I don't know if it was a central nervous system disease or what, but he lived until 1940. He did not have good quality of life. He lived with us for a while in our house on Forest Place, 432 Forest Place. And my job as about, what I've been, 7, 8 years old, was to take him to the movies. And it cost a dime to get in the movie. We'd walk down the hill, Long Lake Shore Drive, to the movie. And that was his pleasure. And he always wore a suit, white shirt and a tie, and a felt hat. And we would walk along, and I would be sent to go and kind of look after him, make sure he didn't fall or something. But that was a treat for me, too, to go to the movies. And I remember seeing The Adventures of Marco Polo. And I was horrified by the trap door that opened up and the shaking, sweating prisoner would fall into a pit of lions. And I had nightmares for weeks that my bed in my little room was going to fall into the basement to the pit of lions. And Mother kind of huffed and puffed and said, "Dad, you shouldn't take her to see things like that." But
How old were you about that time?
I was born in 1928, and so this would have been from about the 1935 to 40. So I would have been about 8 or 9,
You said
something like that.
I'm sorry, you did say that.
Yeah. So then his health deteriorated, and he had to have round-the-clock care. So then he went to a place in Plymouth that they found for him. I think it wasn't anything as nice as Miller's Mary Manor. They didn't have anything that nice. But it was a place where people could go, and that's where he lived when he died. And his funeral was at the Easter Day Funeral Parlor, which would have been right across the street from the library where I am now. And his daughter, Aunt Sue, my Aunt Sue, his daughter, and I went in the front door, and there was a line of people lining up to walk past his coffin. And my own mother and her sister Wilma, called Billy, were going through this motions of this funeral very coldly and perfunctory and dutifully. And Aunt Sue was the only one who showed any emotion at that. And I think that's interesting because in her memories, which you taped last time I was here, she talks about how she and her father shared all that laughter. I mean, maybe they were making fun of somebody that was, or seeing humor in things. They shared that. And apparently he didn't share that with other members of his family. You just can't dictate that someone have a certain type of sense of humor. But when you find someone that has that same sense of humor, it's a rare treasure. So as Aunt Sue and I went down that little dark hallway into the lighted area where his coffin was open, I felt her hand gripping my shoulder. And she said, "I'm just going to hang on to you, honey. You hold me up for this." And we walked past his coffin, and we stood there for a moment, and it was the first time I had ever seen him when he wasn't shaking. He looked still and peaceful. And that is my last memory of him. And that was 65 years ago this November. And it's really an emotional experience to be looking into his life now in depth and talking about him and getting a chance to talk about him for posterity. And I'm grateful to have the chance to do it. And as I've been saying to Don, like a broken record, I just hope I can get it right for him. I thought for a minute you were Emily from a distance.
Okay, I goofed that up. I'm sorry. Gonna reshoot that. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. That was me.
above my head on the left side of the windows is a bas-relief of my grandfather, George Brenton Eisenhard. He came here to found the science department and was the first science teacher, taught chemistry and physics, and set up a laboratory here. His classrooms and his laboratory were on the 4th floor of Main Barrack, as were, I understand, all the classrooms, as well as the library. He loved science and was a very dedicated teacher, had a great sense of humor, and loved to get out on the campus and do practical demonstrations of the things he was teaching in his laboratory. And he loved his students, and one of his greatest thrills was getting back results of college board examinations, showing how well his students had done in physics and chemistry and gotten into the college of their choice. It's a great honor to my family, to me, to know that he is recognized like that, because anyone that has worked in education knows that it takes a special person to be dedicated to it and to work long hours in not only the teaching and the grading papers, but at Culver, because it's a boarding student, you're a surrogate parent. You have to be in the dormitory at night, you have to coach sports, you have to eat in the dining hall, you have to be a counselor and listen to them cry when they're homesick. Well, hardly any ever are, of course, and especially don't cry about it. But, any problems that come up, you're just like a dad here when you're a faculty member. And he loved Culver. The Leadbetter is in the background, and before the school had the Leadbetter, they had the O.W. Fowler, which was very important in summer school life here. I was at the launching of the Fowler, and not only that, but I knew Commander Fowler. So it was just a wonderful thing for me when my father got the idea of having the band go around the lake and play Moonlight Serenades in the summer. He had been a student in Boston where they had outdoor concerts and promenade concerts and swan boats in the park, and he always loved the idea of having music coming across the water. At one time in the early 50s, when the chapel was being built, he had a platform out here, just down a little way, where the band played and the audience sat on the floor, on the land, because the band had always played at Players Hill, which was a natural amphitheater setting behind where the chapel is now. So for several years, the band was just displaced. So he had this platform with the help of Wilford Kraft and Mr. Hossamer, the two mainstays of the Culver Naval School equipment, and make that platform. And then the Moonlight Serenade, as he dubbed it, became a tradition. He hand wrote the music at our dining room table at our house up in North Terrace. Mother and I would hum it, and he would write it. And Sailing Along on Moonlight Bay and Shine on Harvest Moon, and some of the beautiful waltzes and other music that was so popular, and perhaps more of his day, romantic music of his day, and so that was a lot of fun. And I believe that the band has that music. He wrote it on little pages this big, and the boys had snapper clothespins to hold it on their music stands so it wouldn't blow away out on the lake. I think the first night out they lost music when the breeze came up. So I remember the scramble through my mother's clothespin bag for snapper clothespins to hold that down. And then some of the alumni, some of the boys couldn't resist keeping those little pages for souvenirs. And over the years, he would write off more parts, oh, I need more clarinet parts, or I need more parts. And I have met several alumni who say, oh, I probably shouldn't admit this, but I took my music with me after the last concert, and I have it framed on my living room wall. Well, what a compliment. That is a great compliment to a teacher, I think.
Better, okay. Now you said you remember you were there at the very first Moonlight Serenade.
I was at the very first water performance of the Culver Summer Naval Band because it was during World War II, I believe 42 or maybe 43. The band was giving a concert in the town park with the town band. I believe that town band director's name was Basil O'Reilly. And the two bands would play together at Christmas and various times, so they were having a concert in the town park. The boys at that time wore crisply starched and creased white ducks, dark blue wool blazers with brass buttons, and they shined their shoes so you could really see your face and toes in those black shoes. And they had their instruments. The best laid plans. The bus to take them to the town park wasn't available or didn't have gasoline. Gasoline was taken away. And so there was talk, and Daddy was concerned. I could just see the look on his face. Well, we can't march, he'll get all dusty. And what about their instruments? What will we do? They can't march along the road. Cutters. Quickly down to the dock to talk to Mr. Kraft, who was a really good friend of Daddy's. Never could say, I don't think so, no, it won't work, can't do it. I don't think those words were in his vocabulary. And neither were they in my dad's. How can we do this? So they hitched up the cutters, towed them with one of the power boats, which were beautiful mahogany Chris Crafts, which had been donated by the Culvers. Towed them. They left the dock. They had a couple spaces in the back of one of the cutters, the last cutter in the back. Daddy said, you can ask your friend Patty Mather, and you and she can ride in that cutter. There's a seat in the back. Now, the reason I think that might have been 1942 was because of the dress I was wearing, which was red and white striped, and is in some other pictures that were taken at that time. I was still growing, so I don't think I would have worn the dress more than about one season. My mother had made the dress for me. So, Daddy and I, very important, excited, got into the back seat of the cutters. The boys left their instrument cases over here, someplace under safekeeping. They boarded the cutters, took off from the Academy dock. We're rounding the point down here on this side of the town park, and we could see the lights in the park. And Daddy, who was in the power boat in front with Mr. Kraft, could see that the town park was packed with people. What a thrill, you go out to perform and you work hard and get ready. You don't know if anyone's going to be there or not. So that was very exciting. So Daddy told them to play Anchors Away. So they all knew it by heart. And he said, pass it out as loud as you can. And they came around that point up to the dock playing Anchors Away, and people stood up and cheered. So that's a wonderful memory.
Great. That's a great story. My last question is that was a pretty big deal, the Moonlight Serenade every year, was it not?
It was, it was.
All around the lake. Did it go all across?
It kind of got a life of its own. You know how things do. And at first, I think Daddy and Mr. Kraft thought they could do the whole lake in one night. But then there were problems to work out, like the west side being very shallow, and like the possibility of rocks on the east shore, which is rocky, and of the wind coming up. And at that time, there weren't very many, if any, cottages on the far south side in that swampy area. That's a Venetian village. That wasn't there. So they had things to work out. And not to mention the full moon, which Daddy always wanted for the concert. Summer school was full 8 weeks then. Now I don't think this last summer there was a full moon during the period of camp, which is just a little over 5 weeks, I think now. Anyway, there were a lot of details to think about, and Daddy would come home for lunch and Mother and I'd say, oh, we thought of another song. And so he'd get the music paper and write it. Well, he had a cup of coffee there and he was eating his pork chop or whatever it was. So then it was a great thrill to him when they started off. He never expected audience response. And it was always just overwhelming to him. And I imagine to any artist or performer, that kind of a personal contact with your audience or with somebody who praises your efforts is just the best reward in the world. So the first time people put out lanterns on their docks, they put out paper bags with candles in them, and that started it. Then it was Christmas lights, then people were having parties, then people were coming out in their boats. The last time I was out in a boat for that, we couldn't hear the music. There were so many boats going following in a flotilla along. But it was very, very rewarding thing to do. And also on the map that the state of Indiana put out, I believe they used to call them fun maps. They had little pictures on them of things to do. And it was the first time that was recognized, Culver was recognized, was when they put a little picture of the Fowler, a drawing in color over Lake Maxinkuckeee on the Indiana State tourist map. I have one of those maps out. So that was very rewarding.
Yeah. Okay, now we're ready, so go ahead.
Okay, Jeff Kenney at the Culver Union Township Public Library has asked me to come back and talk about my father, Edward Tilden Payson, who had a long career at the Academy and was well known in Indiana for his music and photography and for establishing the Moonlight Serenade on Lake Maxinkuckeee. Well, it's absolutely humbling to be sitting here talking about him. He was a man who didn't talk about himself, and for that matter, I can't remember hearing him talk about anyone else much, really, except maybe just a short sentence here and there. And so I've thought a lot about it, about what I can say about him, and I'm going to start with this picture of him with his parents. He was born in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and he came from a long line of musicians. As near as I can tell from looking at the family records, there are 11 Edward Paysons going back to the Revolutionary War. And they were all musicians of some sort. Like one of them, the first one, was with George Washington's Continental Army when the drums gave the signal for the troop movements. And his mother, Grace Saunders Payson, was from a long line of Grand Banks fishermen. And his father and grandfather and all these musicians going back were also ministers, probably Quakers, and probably also fishermen, you know, to make ends meet. and put food on the table. And I have quite a few of Grace Saunders' recipes, and a lot of them are for fish, which kind of figures since her father and brother were fishermen. My grandfather, Edward Payson, my daddy's grandfather, died rather suddenly, and as so often happens, the finger of fate changes a lot of lives. And my grandfather, this man, my dad's father, decided to get out of Massachusetts, get out of the music teaching business, and become a surveyor and move out west to California. So they started out later. After this was taken, another child came, Evelyn. So I think about 1905, he started out for the West and got as far as Alexandria, Indiana, and I don't know what the circumstances were, but they stayed in Alexandria. Alexandria was a good little manufacturing town northeast of Indianapolis, where they made glass hoods for lanterns and coal oil lamps and hurricane globes and lamps for buggies. And so the glass factory was a big employer and contributed to the economy. And all the little towns, most little towns in the United States then had town bands. Culver had one, as a matter of fact. And the citizens would get out on Saturday night and play in the park and play for parades. So my grandfather found that the surveying business wasn't what he thought it was going to be, and that he could make a better living as music master and band director, and later high school music teacher and band director, and also as church organist. He was a fine organist. So they stayed in Alexandria, Indiana. Meantime, Edward was growing up, and Edward was a musical genius, and he was just born with that ability. And coming from a long line of probably a little better than average musicians, my grandfather was certainly much better than average organist, better than average musicians, they suddenly have a genius in the family. My father organized a cornet band in the town of Alexandria, showing his entrepreneurial interests even at the age of about 12 or 13. There he is, right there, with all his friends that he taught to play the cornet. And they would play for various parades and in the parks in Alexandria, and every now and then they put on minstrel shows, which were popular then. And this would have been about 1913 or 1914. And at this time, he was proficient on all band instruments and a little on the piano. He never liked playing the piano, but he certainly used the piano later on when he was composing music. And then the finger of fate struck again when his mother died very suddenly. When he was about 16, she sat down fully clothed in a rocking chair in their living room and died. Kind of an embolism, I believe it must have been, or some sudden heart attack. And that was very traumatic. So he finished high school in Alexandria and became kind of just kind of a lost person, I guess, without his mother. And after his mother died in Alexandria, his father, my dad's father, decided that Edward needed more education and more training and more discipline. So he sent him up to Culver Summer School. And because he was already accomplished in music, he could play in the band. And I have this early picture of the summer school band, 1921. It's in 2 layers, but it is a long picture. And my dad is right here in the front row, right here. And Captain O'Callahan is right over here, who was the band director at that time. And then some of the things Daddy said about being a midshipman at that time were interesting. It must have been run a lot like the Annapolis or the Naval School was. In order to pass these achievement tests that they took called Tuxus programs, one of the things he had to do was jump into deep water, 12 feet deep, fully dressed, with his midi necktie, lace-up shoes, and get all that off down to his underwear and get out of the water without drowning. And that was one of the things they had to do to qualify. I mean, it was a tough place then, very tough. But he liked it, and he did well here, so he came back to winter school and graduated from winter school in 1922, and he was the bugler. He got a scholarship, small amount, not much. And I was interested in seeing the Tom Brown of Culver movie because it showed the bugle calls being blown through a huge leather megaphone. And that's what Daddy did. He would stand up on top of the building and blow reveille and breakfast and classes and lunch, and everything was blown, and every bugle call for everything we did. And then after he graduated from Culver, he went to Harvard. The dream of, as he, in his own words, said, the dream of every small-town New England businessman is to have a son go to Harvard. So Daddy went to Harvard from Indiana, and then, but I forgot a little something here. The finger of fate again. His father married the girl next door in Alexandria, who was quite a bit younger. Not as young as his own kids, but pretty young. That's hard for teenagers to take. And my dad and his sister were never really, family was never a unit then, after that. And a lot of the family things were lost and gone. And as a boy, my dad built doll furniture and doll houses, miniature rooms. He had a fantastic model railroad layout with one of his best friends, Bill. He and Bill were like the Gold Dust twins, I guess, in Alexandria, always working on their model railroads and playing their cornets and doing things together. And so all the model railroad stuff and all the doll furniture that he made for Sister was gone or dissipated, given away, and so forth. When his father's second marriage took place, then it wasn't too very long after that the glass business in Alexandria went downhill, and I would suppose because of the automobile industry, people didn't need lamps for their buggies anymore, and people got electricity and didn't need hurricane lanterns for their coal oil lamps. Is that what they carried? They'd light at night, their lamps. Well, they didn't need those glass shades anymore. So what's about the first thing to go when people have to cut back? Well, it's culture. So they didn't have money for music lessons, and I guess the call of California was pulling on my grandfather, so he sold his house and moved to California with his new wife and his mother, who was quite old at that time. He did not like California at all. California has something called a native son law, and that means if 3 people apply for a job in California and one is totally unqualified but happened to have been born in California, he would get the job, in spite of the ones who maybe had PhDs or something. So apparently my grandfather had some kind of bad experience trying to get a job in California and just stayed there a couple of years at the most. Moved up the coast to Oregon, where he stayed until he died. He loved Oregon. Went to a small town on the coast, a lumber town, seaport called North Bend. And so he was a band director, church organist, music master there. Something happened to the family finances. My dad's 4th year at Harvard never happened. he had been coming to Culver in the summertime as a tactical officer and helper of Colonel Callahan. Probably looked a lot like this. This is dated 1926, and I think that is what they call the open-air barracks in the background. And there are just a couple of midshipmen peeking out the door. And that's how he would have looked at about the time he met my mother, Dorothy Eisenhard. And here is her picture. This was taken when she was at Oberlin, but I think she still looked a lot like that about the time my dad met her. She had taken music lessons from Mrs. Hubble, was a very accomplished pianist. And so they hit it off right away because he was a consummate musician. The only, at the time, as far as I know, string player in Culver, very few musicians in Culver. So they hit it off. And let's see, did I hold up this picture of him with his cello? I think that would have been about 1926. The radio station at the Academy was going great guns, and he and my mother would sit up there for hours and play to fill up the airtime. My mother's father was a faculty member teaching chemistry at the Academy at the time, and in fact, my dad had been a pupil of his and not known that he was taking chemistry from his future father-in-law at the time. But as far as I know, the two of them always got along very well, and I know that he got along very well with my grandmother, and she even came later and lived with us. There was no conflict there at all that I ever saw, no tension. So then he and my mother were married in the Ginlett's house, which was the Swiss chalet that was over, I believe, the Huffington Library, kind of wiped that out. There were two houses there, the superintendent's house, which was the Swiss chalet, and then another house. I can't think of the name of that house. It was both torn down to make room for the Huffington Library. They were married in that house. And then he stayed on at Culver. He got a job as assistant music teacher and tactical officer. And I have his contract. I was kind of interested in it. I don't think he earned more than about $2,000 a year at the most, maybe not even that much. Of course, you know, they got their uniforms because they were required to wear uniforms, the academic instructors, so they got a uniform allowance. So they didn't have to buy clothes, and they could eat their meals in the mess hall, and they could, in fact, they were required to live in the barracks part-time too in the summer. So I guess the school counted that as pay. Okay. But here's a picture of my dad with my mother, his two sisters, and brother-in-law. This was taken by Judd Stinchcomb in the front yard of his house on Main Street in Culver in about 1933. And that little one down in front is me, Martha. Got that? And then in the early 1930s, an orchestra was being formed in Plymouth. And, you know, I can't think of the name of that conductor. Hames, Edward Hames, I just thought of it. Came to Culver to recruit people looking for string players and for people to come from all over the area to play in a Plymouth symphony, which was the forerunner of the South Bend Symphony. So my dad got into that at that time, and after the orchestra became the South Bend Symphony, and Mrs. Morris was its mentor, she really stuck to it and got that symphony going, which was another fact to mention at that time. South Bend was full of European immigrants who had wonderful musical backgrounds. They might have been pipe fitters or something at Bendix or worked at Studebaker, but they all had what the Europeans call house music. They were very accomplished musicians. So that was the nucleus of the South Bend Symphony. And my dad was playing in that, and he soloed with the symphony and played a Mozart cello concerto with the South Bend Symphony, and that was a big event in his life. And I don't remember being there for that concert, but I think I was right front and center on the front row for just about every concert that he played in, and or put on or conducted. Here's a nice picture of him. This might have been taken for the Academy in the 1930s. I don't know if they used this in their publicity file or if that was something for the South Bend Symphony publicity. I have a poster that they put up around town advertising the concert. This might have been part of it. And then I was born in 1928. And at that time, we lived at the new Culver, we lived in a lot of different houses. And in the early 30s, I was told that the bank, the State Exchange Bank, owned most of the houses in Culver because of the Depression. Very bad. So there were a lot of rental houses available. You could rent from the bank. And so we kind of bounced around a little, and then we lived at the new Culver Hotel and had my second birthday party on that big wraparound porch. Then we moved to another house, State Street, I think, and that was the one always called Bank House. And we had a Model T Ford. And you know, band directors are never late. They can't be late because nothing can start without the band, and the band can't do anything without its director. But sometimes that Model T Ford didn't always start. So Mother and I would get in the front seat. Well, there wasn't any place in it for me to sit. It was a two-seater, and there was a luggage compartment behind the front seat, so I stood in that, and they would lift me in and out. So I'd be standing back there. Daddy would give that car a push, and it would go down the hill, and Mother and I would, if we were lucky, we'd be sitting there going, chuff, 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 chuff. And Daddy would come sprinting down the hill, and Mother would slide over, and Daddy would drive us over to the Academy, to the parade or the band concert. But if the car died, if the engine died at the bottom, there would be probably a few cuss words not meant for my little ears, but, you know, not bad by today's standards. Daddy would have to crank that car, which he did not like doing. It was just an awful chore for him, but he would get it going. And then I think he sold the car. But I just had a few memories of having that car, and I have memories of walking with my parents from that house to the Academy, walking along the lake with the two of them and getting over there on time for the band concerts and the parades. And then about, when I was about 5, we moved to the house at 432 Forest Place, which was owned by Colonel Walmer. And we enjoyed that house very much. Forest Place was a wonderful neighborhood in Culver. We all knew each other, we all played together. A lot of the men, Wallace Leland, Herbert Keller, Charles McMinn, Colonel Kellum, my dad, and then just across the street and down a little bit was Obanoff, and all those men worked at the Academy, and most all of them walked to and from work in the 30s. And the children all played together, and it was a very nice place to grow up on that street. And that was taken at the new Culver Hotel. And I'm wearing a pink silk dress that was all made by hand for me by the mother of one of the band boys. my birth was announced in the Vedette, and I have a little silver mug given to me by the summer school band, 1928 summer school band. And then my parents moved to Forest Place, and then I started school. I started first grade from Forest Place, and let's see. Then my dad wanted to finish his college degree. He needed to finish his college degree. And the school agreed to let him have 2 winters off to go back to college, or 1 winter. I don't know exactly what his arrangements were. It's possible that that's in his file. And Mother thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if he could go to Oberlin? Because she had gone to Oberlin. You could see in this picture of her how happy she was there and how she loved the atmosphere there. And the music would be such a wonderful place. And my dad had been studying business at Harvard. And this is the irony of the whole thing about his education. His father finally had a musical genius in the family after all this long line of just above average or mediocre musicians, and they wanted him to study business. That was the dream of the New England father, to have their son go to Harvard and study business. Well, my father had majored in French at Harvard, which maybe was modern languages, which was kind of just a little bit to the side, you know, but he did very, very well in it. And, you know, they were just going to make a businessman out of him. And he was not going to have it. Did not want to be a businessman. And he wasn't a businessman. He was a musician. And he was smart enough to know that at an early age. So it turned out that Oberlin did not have, how did that work out? Worcester College in Worcester, Ohio, and Oberlin had a reciprocal agreement. And it ended up with my dad going to Worcester and getting a very small compensation for starting up a band. Worcester wanted a band. This was classic networking between the teachers at Oberlin and the teachers at Worcester, that Worcester didn't have a band and they needed a band. And they could let my dad do the band directing there, start up a band, and take classes at Worcester and take his cello lessons at Oberlin. Worcester did not have a cello teacher. So Daddy took lessons from a Mr. Gierner at Oberlin. As far as I know, these are the first cello lessons he had since someone in Alexandria or nearby Fairmount showed him how to play a stringed instrument when he was a teenager. And all during those years on Forest Place and when he was playing in the South Bend Symphony, he played the most wonderful music, and I never asked myself, well, how did he learn to do that? He must have taught himself. He just had a natural instinct for playing the cello. And one of his favorite things to play was one of the Bach suites for an accompanied cello, Suite Number 3, and I brought a recording of that. Not him playing, Janos Starker playing, but it's what I grew up hearing in Forest Place and house, because I would be going to sleep, he'd be playing that. And he and my mother played together a lot. As I said, they played on the radio station. And then we went over to Worcester and lived over there 2 years. And between the 2 winter sessions, we drove to Oregon, visit his father in Oregon, and went on the Oregon Trail, which is a wonderful history lesson for me, and then got out to Oregon and saw the Japanese freighters coming into the port right below my grandfather's house, hauling out scrap iron by the shipload, which they were going to all throw back at us, in a few years. And then there was the lumber yard, and then his father being a musician, and Daddy had taken his cello out there, and we just had a wonderful time. Came back, Daddy really wanted to stay on at Worcester. He had started the band, and they were still wearing the kilts. That was Daddy's idea, that the band be dressed in kilts. When the board of directors wanted uniforms for the band, Daddy said, well, kilts, why not? It's a Scotch Presbyterian school. So the kilts were ordered, and they were made by Crofters in Scotland. Daddy had come back to Culver. The kilts were coming across the Atlantic Ocean on a freighter, which was torpedoed by a German submarine and went down with all hands. My dad was just devastated. He felt like, I don't know, I mean, that was just the beginning of the bad news that kept coming after the war started. You know, things seemed like a student would be there taking lessons or marching in parade or going to classes, and then you'd hear that they were gone. It was terrible. But the kilts were reordered, and the second ship made it through the North Atlantic. And I just heard about 5 years ago that they used those kilts. They were such wonderful material, thick and heavy and all handmade. But that now, 38, 50, 60 some years later, they're having a fund drive to replace those kilts. They still wear them. The Mothers Club had darned them. And there are a lot of people who remember my dad from there. You know, Coleman Knight, who works at the Academy. His parents went to Worcester and were students there when my dad was there. And then Worcester wanted to hire him and have him stay there, but they did not have the money. They just didn't have the money to add a faculty position. They had piano and voice, and that was the main thing, and they had some string pupils. And the string pupils mostly went to Oberlin, reciprocal agreement for their lessons. And Worcester didn't give, and I think still does not give a master's degree. And I get a sip of my coffee because my throat's getting dry.
Okay. Yeah.
We came back from Worcester and back to the Forest Place house, and I believe I'm sure the Grahams had lived in our house while we were gone. Bill and Bee Graham, Colonel O'Callahan's daughter and son-in-law, had lived in the house while we were gone, and came back, found the house on Forest Place just in fine shape. We just walked in there and came home. Everything in Forest Place was going along about the same as it had for the previous 10 years or so. And my dad had a car that we had bought. We had bought a Willys in Worcester, a new Willys. And the reason he had the money to get that car was because he sold his stamp collection that he had been making since he was a little boy. He sold that at auction in Cleveland for $1,500. We lived on that money, bought that little car, lived on that money for 2 years while he was at Worcester. I mean, lived comfortably. And we took our trip out west to see his father in Oregon. Now that is when Daddy started taking the pictures. He had a Brownie box camera. And we left Worcester and drove west on Route 30. And we went right past Plymouth, Indiana. Route 30, the Lincoln Highway, was a cement road. Going west from Plymouth, still had that restaurant there shaped like a coffee pot, or, you know, all the quaint things. I was in the back seat. And I can remember my dad turning toward Mother and saying, well, Culver's just right down there. Do you want to go down and see it? And a little silence. No. So they drove on. And they had the Brownie camera. And by the time we got to the first really scenic place, trying to think what that was, some kind of national park of geology where the stone is all different colors. Oh, the springs, the mineral springs come up out of the ground and the water flows down and it's caused the stones to turn beautiful shades of red and blue and green. And we stopped at places along the route and saw some cowboys. I think Daddy's first picture that started him off on his photography hobby was a picture of cowboys riding down the road, and we were going along in our little car, and I don't remember much traffic. Don't remember any trucks. We just drove along, and these cowboys passed our car on their horses, and they were wearing bright colored satin shirts, and Daddy rolled down the car window, and the cowboys on their horses leaned over and said, "Come to the rodeo, it's going to be a lot of fun." And they waved, and the dust kind of came up from the horses' hooves, and Daddy snapped a picture of that. And that is a wonderful picture. And we did not go to the rodeo. But that was the beginning, I think, of his photography hobby. And the West is so photogenic, you know. Ansel Adams thought so, and my dad thought so, and got home and started looking at the pictures he'd taken out West, and that was the beginning of his photography hobby, which lasted about 10 years. This is a picture he took of my mother. I believe that was taken about 1940 or 41. Dorothy Eisenhard Payson. And I always liked that picture. That dress was wool, and that she liked it too. And that's a nice picture of her, I think. So then he started developing pictures in the basement of the Forest Place house and printing them. Then in 1940, and I wish I could verify this, if there were phone books around, or any way to verify it, I'm not sure because there's no tax record, he was renting, decided not to buy the Forest Place house for $5,000 when Hed Walmer offered it to him. So we moved to the Academy, to that duplex on North Terrace. And he continued his photography hobby there and had a darkroom in the basement. And that is where my wonderful record of our lives and of life in Culver and all around in the 1940s comes from. After the war, he got color film and did develop a few rolls of color film in the basement. The equipment was very expensive. Couldn't get color film during the war because the government had it all. And after the war, it became available. And then he just didn't do any more photography after that. Got back into cello playing, which he hadn't done much of at all during the war because of not having gas to drive to South Bend for the rehearsals and also having sold his car. So then he got back into cello playing and didn't do any more photography. But the photographs are just priceless. And one of the fun things is that I'm in most of them, and I was not always pleased about being called out to stand and have my picture taken in a blizzard or with something going on in the background, like the the cherry tree in full bloom. Would you climb up in that tree, please? Let me take your picture. Or, oh, how about a picture with those kittens? Or then I got so that I liked it after a while. And many times after school, we'd go to Bigley's, and or the light would be just right. Unusual light filtering through some smoke of burning leaves. It was very artistic. You'd get home from classes at the Academy. He was always out early, up at 7, going to work, getting over there at 8, had to be in a studio all day, and then go out after classes and supervise some kind of sports. They all did it. All the academic instructors had to supervise company sports. Never heard any of them complain about it. And so Daddy was not a really big thing on sports, but he liked crew, so he would go out with the band on the lake. And then they did say that band drill could qualify as some kind of phys ed because the band marched all the time and did so much more work than any other organization, marching and practicing, and the band had to drill because they had to play and march at the same time. So he was always very active. Most of the men were. Bernie Bishop and I talked about that at one time. Her father, Jim Bishop, was kind of a laconic, laid-back person. And that's the way she always saw him, till one day she was walking home from the mailbox and she saw her father running along beside the football field, yelling and flapping his arms, and she couldn't believe it was her father. And when he came home for dinner that night, she said, "What were you doing out there?" And he said, "Well, I was coaching company football. I have to do it, it's in my contract." But he was quite a sportsman too, but she just hadn't seen that side of it. But that's what they all did. But no, he would come home to our house there on North Terrace, get a cup of coffee. He'd have maybe a couple hours off before, if he had to go back for a faculty meeting at night, which he hated, or go back for study hall to coach the ones that were a little slower, or have barracks inspection. So he'd have a couple hours. So we'd get in the car, drive out. During the war too, a lot of the farmers were plowing with teams of horses. There was always the lake, there was always Bigley's orchard, there was always my dog. There was always something going on to take pictures of. And so he didn't like to wear heavy clothes, he didn't wear gloves or an overcoat, and whatever camera equipment he used, he tried to carry in his coat pockets along with the cigarettes and matches. Or if he needed something, I could carry it. I could carry a great big white cardboard to hold up, to reflect the light. That was one of his tricks. I could carry a sheet of, I think it was tin, I'm not sure, but it was something to reflect the lights, because he didn't like to use flash. He had a set of lights, and even had that on Forest Place too, tripods with lights on for a subject, but didn't like to haul any of that stuff around with him. And he loved the band. He absolutely loved, he must have really loved his work, because I never heard him complain about having to go back. After supper, he'd get up and put on his jacket and go back out, and never complained. He was always thinking ahead, planning some musical event, a concert with the town band or the glee club from the high school or the churches, or something that he and Mother were going to do together. And our house was always filled with music, and the Hames or various friends would come down from South Bend, and there'd be chamber music. And then Mother's health got worse, her arthritis, and I guess she got high blood pressure. So about 44, 45, she just didn't play the piano anymore. Arthritis, she had arthritis in her back. When we came back from Worcester, and the news came from friends at Worcester that the kilts had gone down in the North Atlantic, torpedoed by the Germans, all hands on a freighter to the bottom of the North Sea, was just a devastating experience, because I suppose because my father had come from a seafaring family, and because it had been his idea to get the kilts. He was so emotionally involved in that, and that was at the beginning of our knowledge that World War II was coming and looming on the horizon. There was the family, Leonard Kitts, who was in the Army, and the Kitts were in Germany at the time of the Olympics, and Colonel Kitts had his horse, American Lady, in the dressage, and she had won a gold medal, I think, in the Olympics. And they had seen Hitler. And I think the book Mein Kampf was on, I don't know if it was on the bestseller list, if the New York Times had one then or not, but a lot of people were reading Mein Kampf and talking about it. We had a copy of Mein Kampf on our coffee table in 1940. And then the Kitts came back. Marion Kitts was a good friend of Mother's, and Jack was just a little younger than I am, but the families had known each other. And Marion Kitts sat in our living room and talked about the mob spirit and the hysteria in Germany, and these crowds of thousands and thousands of people that were mesmerized by Hitler, and the atmosphere that they had felt in Germany. And I heard all that talk in our living room. And then that was kind of the beginning of our knowledge of the war. The main newspaper being read around here at the time was the Chicago Tribune, which was, I think, very isolationist. And so we kind of got two sides of the story, from people who had been there and from the newspaper editors in Chicago. And then my dad was, still working as band director. The Music and Art building was going. That had been a power plant, and that had been remodeled in the late 30s into the Music and Art building. Warner Williams was artist in residence. There was still a lot of the old guard around, people who had worked with my grandfather Eisenhard. Some of those people were still around. In fact, Warner had known my grandfather Eisenhard and spoke highly of him to me. And then there was that Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. And I was in our living room at the North Terrace house getting ready to go to the Music and Art building to practice for the Sunday school pageant. Mrs. Henderson had organized an Academy Sunday school, which was pretty popular in the 1930s. And that was, I didn't realize at the time, but that was what they call very town and gown. The Academy children of faculty members and faculty members, the adults went to the Academy chapel service, and the children had no Sunday school. So she got busy and organized one, which was based entirely on her Methodist dogma, I guess you call it. It was basically Methodist Sunday school. And we were going to put on a Christmas pageant, which we did every year. So we were going to practice for that over in the Music and Art building. And I was just about on my way out of the house. Daddy had gone for something someplace, maybe to the mess hall. And Mother turned on what she thought was going to be the New York Philharmonic, which she always enjoyed, and it was the Roosevelt making a speech about Pearl Harbor. So Patty Mather, I seem to remember Lee Gillette being there. I don't know, Charles McKinney, all the Academy kids, as we were called, Academy kids, were clustered outside the choir room, which was locked. And so we were standing there in the kind of darkness of that hallway, and some of the kids had known about Pearl Harbor, and some hadn't. I had known about it because our radio was turned on. Some didn't know about it, so there was a buzz going on. Mrs. Barretta came hurrying up with the keys to the choir room, and we all filed in there. And I guess at that time, the instructors and the military officers at the Academy were hurriedly organizing some kind of an assembly to tell the cadets about what was going on, because I think they were not allowed radios in their rooms. So there was quite a lot of activity going on that afternoon. But I remember that Mrs. Barretta and Mrs. Henderson came in and said, we'll go on with our rehearsal anyway. And Russell Leonard had a deep voice. He was about 12, I guess, and his voice was pretty deep. And he started reading in that deep voice the Christmas story from the Bible. What is it, Mark? Book of Mark. you know, about Mary and Jesus going out. And we just weren't afraid. We knew something horrible had happened. I was worried sick about my grandfather right on the West Coast and all those Japanese all over the place out there. And we had been out there, you know, we knew about how close that was to Japan. But we were just not, I just don't remember any sense of fear. And there was this big scrambling then because there were so many young men on the faculty, and they would have to go into the service. But the school got grants for them to stay until after exams in January before they had to report, so they could at least get through that part of the academic year. And, you know, I do not remember that Sunday school pageant ever taking place. But I think there was no Sunday school after that, because for one thing, maybe the kids were growing up. The young women who ran it left to go with their young husbands to go into the service or to go home wherever they went when the whole place broke up because the war had started. The Academy immediately organized Home Guard. Now, Patty Mather and I just cracked up and giggled till our sides ached at the thought of our fathers defending the Academy out there on State Route 10, which was where they were assigned. They had to go out a certain time of night, in addition to everything else they had to do from dawn to midnight. They had to go out and stand guard at the north gate. And we don't know what they were looking for. Were tanks going to come rolling down State Road 10, or maybe German bombers? We didn't know. But we didn't think that that was going to happen. But the school was highly organized for civil defense. We had blackout curtains. We had war bond drives. We bought savings stamps at school and pasted them in little books. And everything was just mobilized. I don't remember any feeling of gloom, doom, defeat. It was just a real positive attitude, as far as I remember, that everybody was going to do what they could. I mean, we were going to plow up the backyard and grow tomatoes and can them, and we did. You know, it wasn't like, you know, oh, this guy is falling. There wasn't any of that attitude at all. Of course, there was a big turnout at the Academy. Of course, Gregory was back in the Army, and they brought back Colonel Fleet to be superintendent. They brought back some people to teach that seemed positively ancient, who may have retired, but they came back. And there was the sadness of hearing that people that we knew had been killed in the war. I think there were, now this is in the Culver Citizen, could be looked up, of the men who were in the service from the town of Culver, which couldn't have been that great a number. I think 11 of them were captured and imprisoned in Germany for almost the whole duration of the war, which I thought was a pretty high percentage of captives out of one town. Then the government started dividing the men up. For instance, they'd send one brother to the Pacific and one to the European theater, so they didn't have whole families on the same ship and that sort of thing. They started changing their policy. Then word started coming back to the Academy. Well, first my dad would get Christmas cards at Christmas. He always sent out a Christmas card, all his band people every Christmas, and he got a lot of cards back, and he'd get back military cards. Walt Disney had designed a Donald Duck Christmas card for, oh no, it was Pluto, I think. There was a destroyer or minesweeper, the Pluto, and one of Daddy's students was on the Pluto and sent a Christmas card that'd been designed by Walt Disney for the crew to send out. Things like that, and then the bad news coming back to the school, so-and-so, you know, who seemed to be just there, and then they were gone. my mother got a huge map of the world and put it up on the kitchen wall. And every night we listened to H.V. Kaltenborn on the radio, who gave the news and the commentary. And we followed as best we could what was going on. One of the things that people from Culver loved to do as a getaway was go into Chicago for the day and maybe shop at Beals, have a nice lunch, and you could ride up on the train and come back in the evening to Hibbard or Plymouth. And so when we'd go into Union Station in Chicago, it was a solid mass of khaki uniforms, young men lining up to get on troop trains. And that summer of '42, my dad's sister, Evelyn, lived out on Long Island, way out on the end, and there were German submarines off the East Coast, and it was common knowledge there were a lot of them out there. So she sent her son, Jim Cole, who was, I think, about 10 at the time, to spend the summer with us. She just wanted him out of there. And so he spent the summer with us, and it was like a little brother. We had a lot of fun. He and Billy Graham were the same age, and they gathered turtles, and they swam, and they played all over along the lake. And Jimmy Cole would go to band practice and go out to the Music and Art Building, and some of the midshipmen heard him saying, Uncle Ed, to my dad. So they picked up on that. They thought that was very funny that their stern music teacher was also called Uncle Ed. So I think for a while his nickname was Uncle Ed. Then the fall came, and it seemed as though things had settled down. The East Coast was pretty secure, and they weren't worrying about an invasion. And so we took Jimmy to Plymouth to put him on the train to go on the Pennsylvania Railroad right from Plymouth right into Union Station in New York City. And he had his skin knees and his mosquito bites and his mason jars with minnows and a turtle and little stuff that he was taking back. It was just sweet. And that whole train that he got on was full of soldiers going to the East Coast to be shipped out. And they made a pet of him. When he got on the train, they were all looking out the window. He said, yeah, I'll bet they're wishing you were getting on that train, because I was, about 14? No, I didn't get on the train, but he did. So he had very good care on the train and told his mother all about it when he got off in New York. And the school, of course, was just going full tilt because of the military background. People wanted their sons to have that training and not go in cold turkey to basic training. And now I just want to say that I think it was, now I could verify this too, 42, fall of 42, things weren't going well. We were optimistic and everybody was working hard, and we were losing the war. It was horrible what was happening. And oh, that's blinking, Jeff. Does that mean it's running out of juice?
No, we've got about 5 minutes left on the tape. But
Daddy came in from inspections or barracks duty about 9:30 at night, and he said, come on, we've got to go up past the boathouse. There's a beautiful display of northern lights. So I got my friend Patty Mather, and we jumped in the car, and we went up there, and we drove up, sat up on the hood of the car, and watched this fantastic display of northern lights. And a lot of people thought that was an omen, and thought that it was a good omen. It wasn't really an omen, but it was very heartening to see Mother Nature doing her thing when man had made such a mess. But that was just something that he would do, would be to get us out to see things like that. And I remember that, especially. poster, an advertising poster from the South Bend Symphony concert and Chicago and South Bend Tribune publicity story on my dad soloing with the South Bend Symphony in 1935. He used to joke about it, and he said people paid 25 cents to hear him play Mozart on a cigar box. But I'm sure that it was well worth hearing. He was a wonderful cellist, and he was praised in the reviews in the paper afterward for his technique and feeling. At the same time that South Bend Symphony was being organized, and he was the charter member and first cellist there, he and my mother were providing hours and hours of music on WCMA radio and helping to fill up the time there. And he was a cellist first and foremost all his life. Loved to organize big musical productions and made use of everybody in the community. And I love this picture of an event that he organized with all the town choirs and musicians and the Academy musicians and choirs. This was in the recreation building at the Academy before they had the chapel, and the auditorium. All the events were held in the recreation building. And these are some of the organizers of that. This was taken in my father's studio at the Academy in the M&A. I recognize the draperies. This is my father right here, Basil O'Reilly, the town high school band director, Bess Easterday, Bertha Mae Rust, Ruth Beamer, and this man who looks familiar to me but whose name I do not know. He may have been an organist, come to think of it. And they organized this marvelous program with all the combined musicians in the area. It was the first community festival concert. It was on May 16th, 1947. And I think he had hoped to make it an annual affair, but I don't remember any more of these affairs coming off. There were combined band concerts. The Culver High School Band and the Culver Academy Band played together. And I have this nice letter from M.R. Robinson, who was the editor of the Culver Citizen and one of the town fathers, kind of thanking the Academy for participating, but it was a big success and everybody enjoyed it, enjoyed working together. Music, they say, is an international language and everyone understands it. And then in the early 50s, he went back to the South Bend Symphony, had not played during the war, partly because of gas rationing, not having a car, and then went back to playing, bought a very nice cello, an English cello made in 1740, and he already had a beautiful bow that his father had gotten him. It was called a Kretschmer bow, and you know, they're handmade, and they're really part of the instrument, part of playing. So he had very nice musical equipment to use, and he loved playing chamber music and was instrumental in getting a lot of chamber music groups going in South Bend. And at the same time, the auditorium had been finished, and the Academy Theater and English department and music department were putting things on in the auditorium. Oklahoma, The King and I, Guys and Dolls, wonderful musical events in the auditorium. Daddy was the musical director there. This is an article written by my father for what is not signed or dated, but it certainly looks like an Academy brochure on the Fine Arts Department at Culver. And it shows him at band practice, and he's not wearing a uniform, so I imagine it was in the early 60s, which I think is about the time they stopped wearing, most people, unless they were directly connected with the military, stopped wearing uniforms. Two famous Culver graduates are mentioned, Hal Holbrook, who became an actor on stage and screen, and Ara Barbarian, who took music lessons from my father and became a Metropolitan Opera singer. Both of those men were back in 2003 for the Hall of Fame, Fine Arts Hall of Fame induction, and unfortunately Ara's passed away since then. I heard him sing his first song at Vespers in the lobby of the Memorial Library when he was a cadet, and found out when he came back for the Hall of Fame that he was very nervous about it. I didn't think so at the time. Everyone thought how wonderful he was and how poised and confident, but he's really had that first performance jitters. And Patty Mather, whose husband was Charles C. Mather, the English teacher and theater director at the Academy, and I went to everything our fathers put on, of course. And so we went to all the band concerts and all the assembly programs and all the plays. And so I was there for Hal Holbrook's performance, first performance in the play called Seven Keys to Baldpate. And I don't remember a lot about that play. I do remember, when I think of going to all those things at the Academy, I remember those green wooden benches. I know they must have had at least two men in a big truck that did nothing but move those benches all the time. They moved them to the gym, they moved them to the recreation building, they moved them to the parade ground, or they moved them to the open air theater, and they were always unloading these benches. Well, as a child, of course my feet didn't touch the ground, and there was about this much space, I guess, between the slats of those benches, just enough to pinch. And of course Patty and I had bare legs. We wore dresses and little black shoes and white socks like girls did then. And I can remember how we were squirming on the benches. And I mentioned to Emily that I remember when they got the permanently installed seats on the riding hall terrace, and we all went over to see how nice they were. But last time I was over there, I thought, my God, they've got those green benches out there again. They just can't resist having those green benches everywhere. I guess there weren't quite enough of the permanent seats. They still have to bring out green benches. And I mentioned that to Emily, and she said, you know, they still do have two men in a truck over there moving those green benches around for everything. But that's just kind of a kid memory of having to sit and pay attention and be quiet on an uncomfortable green bench. So, well, when Daddy got back into the South Bend Symphony and the chamber music groups, he wanted a new cello, and he bought in Chicago at a musical instrument place on Michigan Avenue, and I don't remember the name of the place. It was in one of those beautiful old Louis Sullivan buildings with the filigree decoration and the iron grill work. A beautiful English cello made in 1740. And if for a musician to have a fine instrument is just a real, it's like an extension of their body. And so he had this wonderful cello and this wonderful bow. And he was very active in South Bend, played at Notre Dame and St. Mary's, and gave concerts all around. South Bend was very, very fortunate to have a huge Central European immigrant population where they valued house music. The men worked at Bendix. They might have been engineers, they might have been pipe fitters, but they were all first-class star musicians because they had in Europe, and especially Germany, what they called house music. So when Mrs. Morris started the South Bend Symphony with Ed Hames as conductor, they had a huge nucleus to draw on. So that's one reason South Bend has a very rich musical history. Martin Hubel, an instructor at the Academy, a German instructor, and a very fine musician, used to go with Daddy and played clarinet and I think oboe too, with these groups that all played together. So that was a very important part of Daddy's life, and then after he retired, that became his whole life, playing for music groups. And my mother died in 1975, and he was pretty devastated, quite devastated and lost. And his friends, his musical friends in South Bend, got their heads together and decided we're going to keep him so busy that he won't have time to sit around and chain smoke and mope. They even got him a job playing for the Osmonds when they came to the ACC at Notre Dame, the Osmonds. There's some ASCAP musical union rule that wherever a big show goes, they can't just use recorded music, they have to hire a certain number of local musicians. So he played for cello, his 1740 English cello, back up for the Osmonds. And then he also played in a musical at the Morris called 1776, and he had to wear a red, white, and blue sequin costume for that, which he thought was funny. But this were his support group of South Bend musicians keeping him busy, which was a very, very good thing. He continued with the model railroad, which was, I think, his second love, and a love hobby that went back to his childhood. And everybody kind of thinks of him synonymously with railroading, which he was at the Academy. He just loved it. And so here are a few articles about it. I like this one, was in the Vedette, tootin' through the years. It's about Culver's Railroad. And here's a picture of him with some children from nearby schools that came to see the model railroad, which he just loved to show off and show around. And one of the nice things he had after he retired was a trip across Canada on a freight, like the freights, and got to ride in the cab of an engine. Here's a picture of him in a cab. I'm not sure it's the one that pulled him across Canada, but he did love to take train trips, and he went up to northern Michigan and took some train trips. And here's his CV that I made up for him. He never had a CV of his own, curriculum vitae, because he never changed jobs. And so I did this, and had a wonderful time doing it, and I'd like to go through it and kind of annotate it and add memories to this. Here's a picture of him that was taken shortly, well, probably at about the time of his retirement. It might have been an Academy publicity shot, I'm pretty sure it was.
Now when did he retire?
In 1967. And then I believe he worked summer school. He retired from winter school in 67, but retired from summer school in 68. Yeah.
You earlier brought up a bas-relief. Can you talk about that Warner Williams was commissioned to do, and how that came about?
When the time came for him to retire from summer school, he was honored by his students at the instigation of a band counselor named Minegar, M-I-N-E-G-A-R, and I believe his first name was, I think he was called Chuck Minegar. He worked at another private school, I think in Arizona or someplace in the winter, but he came to Culver in the summer. And he was a wonderful band counselor. He and Daddy worked together so well, and he instigated the honor from the students. And so Warner Williams carved a bas-relief, sculpted a bas-relief of Daddy, and the students presented it to him. And it hangs in the Music and Art Building. It's cast in bronze over there. I have a plaster copy of it. And also, Vinegar helped set up the Payson Medal, which is an award given at the Academy, a winter school award, I think, winter school. And as far as I know, I think my father was the first, mother told me, the first instructor to be honored by his students with that kind of recognition. And when he died, some of the alumni were here. Ironically, it was alumni weekend when he died, and they went right down to the Academy business office or alumni office and set up a scholarship in his name right then. And he was the first Academy faculty member to have a scholarship in his name.
And that still continues.
Which is no finer praise can come to any teacher than to have your students come back and thank you for what you did. Even though sometimes he was hard on them, or they didn't care that much to be at Culver, or, you know, life wasn't easy. But they came back in later years and realized with gratitude for what he did. So that's a great honor.
If that scholarship still continues?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So after he...
And people are still giving money. I get notices quite often from alumni who have donated money to that, so I write them.
Well, when he retired, I noticed you brought some letters. It seems like there was an outpouring of people kind of wanting to give him a little tribute.
That's right. I have these snapshots that were taken by Roy Halverson. Roy Halverson was his roommate at Culver. I'm not sure if it was winter or summer school, but he and Roy kept in touch over the years. And Roy Halverson and Roy Wells were two of his good friends at Culver, and they both came for his retirement parade and final band concert. And then I have this stack of letters from alumni, some of the letters that they wrote, and this citation that was read and given to him, and that looks like Jean Williams' calligraphy to me. She was the wife of Warner Williams, and she did beautiful calligraphy. And it's very humbling for me to talk about a person like that, and I just hope that you know, if he were here, if he could be here and read these letters from alumni. I know this happened because when he was dying and in the hospital, some of the alumni came to see him and told him about, you know, reminiscing about things that happened. And his own comment was, just doing my job. And that would be his attitude now. Just doing his job.
You mentioned his, I think in a previous visit you brought, and I don't know if we've talked about this in the film, some of the honors the Woodcrafters gave him. Didn't he also write, like, he wrote some of their songs?
He wrote a Woodcraft marching song, and he would go over and help with the Drum and Bugle Corps into shape at the beginning of summer school. And when the Drum and Bugle Corps, when the Woodcraft camp was up behind the mess hall where the chapel is now, the Woodcraft Drum and Bugle Corps would drum the Woodcrafters into the mess hall at least twice a day. I don't think they did it at breakfast, but they did it at lunch. And sometimes it just sounded pretty awful. And they got a reputation for being called the Dumb and Bumble, which wasn't nice at all. And they tried so hard, and they were just little boys, and they had to march and play at the same time, which couldn't be very easy. And so it was a lot of fun when the Drum and Bugle Corps and the big band played together at parade, which they did frequently. And because of Daddy's early life of having his cornet band in Alexandria, Indiana, he loved to teach little boys to play instruments and drums and bugles, and the Drum and Bugle Corps was really in the 40s and 50s. They were wonderful, and a lot of those Drum and Bugle Corps Woodcrafters came into the Naval Band and then came back and were band counselors in the summer. So there's continuity there.
I'm going to guess they're still performing some of the things he wrote up for Woodcraft and for the winter school, maybe?
I didn't hear anything much the last couple of years.
But they did for a long time.
But they're building up the Woodcraft music program again. They are building that back up.
So, I'll let you get off the hook here in a minute. After his retirement, then he spent a lot of time, it sounds like, playing with the symphony.
That's right. His South Bend Symphony and his chamber music groups in South Bend and the model railroading and his granddaughters.
So he got to be involved in his
He
granddaughters.
was very busy and very happy in his retirement, I think.
Okay. Just so we have this, when did he pass away?
He died on May 22nd, 1977. And he died of cancer of the pancreas, and he was sick 3 weeks. And that was the only time in his entire life that I know of that he was ever sick, except for the ear trouble he had as a boy, but he was not hospitalized for that. But his final illness was, as far as I know, his only illness. And he had gone to Harvard College for 3 years, and I had read that after he died, they were doing research to see if there was a connection between caffeine, nicotine, and cancer of the pancreas. And I thought, oh boy, we could prove it. And I didn't hear much more about that research after that, but I did write to Harvard and offer his medical history and his history of smoking and drinking coffee.
Now, when he passed away, and I'll cut this out, when he did pass away, yeah, you already mentioned the alumni went down and started a scholarship. I mean, I get the impression there was quite a...
They were here. There were a
yeah.
lot of band alumni here for their reunion that Sunday that he died. So they did go over. In fact, it was Tom Williams, MD, 47, I believe, band, who started the scholarship in his name. Went right over and put in a contribution and started that up. And it's still going, and I still get letters from the development office saying that so-and-so maybe has sent a contribution in his name, in his memory. That's a very great tribute.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd kind of like to add about his looking back? I mean, I'm sure you could add hours worth of, I mean, we can always film more too, of course.
Well, I could tell you about my last piano lesson.
Would you like to sit down, by the way, since you're...
Oh, okay.
I just don't want to make you stand forever.
That's all right. I hadn't thought that much about standing.
Okay.
Okay. When I was back here for the induction ceremony for the Hall of Fame, a man, I don't know his name, came up to me when it was over and said, "How did you escape having to take music lessons?" Because I had a very talented father and a very talented mother. Well, I did have to take music lessons. I didn't entirely escape. So one day I came home from school, the sun was shining, it was a beautiful afternoon, fall, probably late fall. We lived on Forest Place, 432 Forest Place, and in the south end of the living room was my grandmother's beautiful baby grand piano. The house seemed to be quite empty, and I was going to my lesson pretty soon, Mrs. Hayes, and so I thought I'd run through my lesson. So I was playing a piece by Franz Liszt, and I made a fatal mistake, I think. It's always a fatal mistake to think you're doing well. And I was enjoying playing it, and I thought I was doing well, and all of a sudden, there's a voice boomed down, seemingly from right under the piano, sending shock waves through me. "That is not a waltz!" Stomp, stomp, stomp came footsteps up the steps, basement steps. I went on the piano keys. Pretty soon I was bawling my eyes out. And I don't remember if I left there and went to that piano lesson and tried to get through it, or if after that the piano lessons were just canceled. I don't remember another piano lesson after that. I do know that after a period of maybe a week or so, very frosty relationships in the house, very frosty, two tickets to Sonia Henny's ice review appeared in the mail. Sonia Henny had a traveling ice skating show that came to Chicago, and I adored Sonia Henny, and I used to skate around on the lake on one foot, pretending I was Sonia Henny, I guess, before I fell. But anyway, it was a big treat, his way of making up to me for this awful blow-up we'd had. So he and I went into Chicago on the train, and we had a wonderful evening, and we saw Sonia Henny's ice review, and he took his camera, and he took a black and white picture for me, Sonia Henny down there on the ice. Just a little speck, but that's Sonia Henny in person. And he made 2 prints of that picture, one for me and one for my best friend, Patty Mather. Well, that was my last music lesson.
Now, you mentioned you falling through the ice.
I
That
did
sounded
fall
kind of
through the
interesting.
I fell through the ice. First of all, you have to know the kind of clothes people wore. In the 30s, we had these monstrous wool-lined things to wear that were called snow pants. And we wore those when we were sledding or building snowmen, walking to school, walking home from school. They were, I think, had elastic waist, elastic around the ankles. They were lined with flannel. They were thick wool. Mine were brown. And we had these thick coats, scarves, hats, and our mothers dressed us up with so many clothes on. In fact, I think mothers tend to still do that. If I see family circus of the little kids kind of like this, you know, they have so many clothes on they can't bend over. Well, I was dressed in one of those outfits, and I think I was about 8 or 9 years old. And I was visiting my friend Shirley Wood, whose father was PMS&T at the Academy. And the Woods were living in the house that was right behind the inn. It's been torn down now. It was called the Braden House. It's next, the Braden House was behind the inn facing the lake, and then there was the Gentleland House. The Woods were staying in the Braden House. And I was playing with Shirley Wood. I had been told not to go out on that ice. Mothers all around, all the mothers in town feared the lake, and we were all, had this drummed into us about safety on the lake. Well, there was a boathouse down there, I think. There'd been a dock there in the summer, and there was a little boathouse. And Shirley and I were just playing around, and that was before the wall was built by Dave Burns. That kind of went, sloped down. That must have been before the wall. That was 1938. I don't think that wall was built until about 40 or 41. I'd like to check on that. I don't think that wall was there. And there might have been some steps down to the lake. I think there were. And Shirley and I went out on the ice, and there must have been an artesian well under the ice, and I walked over it and I went down. I went down to my armpits. And I remember the panic that I felt and how hard it was for me to get out. And Shirley's mother was absolutely irate, and she even said she was glad it wasn't Shirley that had fallen through. She wasn't supposed to go on the ice either, and of course nobody would have known if I hadn't fallen through. But we both got good talking to, and I had to have all my clothes removed. I was sopping wet with ice water, and so I did learn my lesson. You know, they say when kids are bad. When kids disobey, they get hurt, and I did. I fell through the ice.
Well, and something I learned, you said in the story about the kids falling through, there was a fire whistle just for lake falling.
There was a warning signal. The firemen had a warning signal of the siren blowing continuously without fluctuating, and that warning meant that there was in trouble on the lake, and it was used in the summer for boating accidents and in the winter also. And it was terrifying. It just made your hair stand on end because it was only used in very serious situations, and it was frightening.
Would you mind telling of your memories of when those children fell?
I could tell you, and I'm sorry that this is sort of a, didn't research this. I don't know the exact year. I would guess that it was about 1943. A group of children of mess hall waiters was walking across the ice, cutting across. And I think they had been told not to cut across. They had been told to walk along the tracks. They were going to the Saturday night movie at the Academy, which was, I think, free for Academy employees. But they cut across the ice. And they weren't too far from where I fell through. There are all those artesian wells all along that end of the lake, along the north end of the lake. And they fell through. But I was in our living room of our house on North Terrace, and I guess Daddy had already gone out someplace. He was always going out after dinner to have some kind of duty at the Academy and supervise this or that. And so I was going out the door, I guess, to go with Patty to the movie, and that siren started up. And Mother just was standing there with me, and I was putting on my coat, and she just turned white, and she said, "That means someone's in the lake." And at that time, I think we found out that 5 children had drowned that night, and they thought that some had gone in to help the little ones out and then not been able to get out themselves, because as you go to the edge of a hole, it keeps breaking. And possibly because they were walking and it was deep winter, they were dressed the way I had been, in heavy clothes. My Uncle George was in a boating accident, and a lake accident. His friend that he was with saved him, and his friend was Bob Werner, a relative of yours perhaps?
Yes.
He and, this is George Brenton Eisenhard Jr., and they were boys. I don't know how old they might have been, 12, maybe 10 or 12. They were going down that hill. There's a name for that hill. It's between the town and the Academy. It's very steep, and there was a hotel up there at one time.
Lakeview
It's very
Hotel.
steep, Lakeview Hotel. That hill. And they were sledding down that hill out onto the ice. And my uncle, who was called Bud, hit one of these artesian well soft spots. I've got it backward. It was Bob Werner who hit the soft spot and went out under the ice, way out under the ice. From the soft spot where he went into a hard, under the hard, thick ice. And there was nobody around, but my Uncle Bud was able to get him out somehow. I don't know. He was very, very strong and very athletic, and I think he just beat a hole in the ice, maybe with the sled runners or something, and he got Bob Werner out. And later, I don't know if it was the following summer or what summer it was, Bob Werner saved my uncle's life when the 2 boys, doing what they were not supposed to do, swimming in a gravel pit north of Culver, that one between Culver and Burr Oak. My uncle's bathing suit belt got caught on a log or board or something down in the pit. And Bob Werner dove and stayed underwater long enough to unhook Bud from that, so he saved him. Terrible things happen around water.
With those children that went through, you said, I don't know if you got to finish the story earlier, Dave Burns was kind of a hero of that?
Dave Burns was the hero of the night, and he had young children of his own, and he tried so hard to save them, and he was the one who brought their bodies out. And he formed a chain of firemen. There were a lot of other firemen, and other people went racing to help. There were a lot of people in town. I just don't happen to know their names, but they were just as brave and did everything they could and went out on their stomachs so they wouldn't fall in, and held each other's ankles, that sort of thing. But it was too late. The children had all drowned.
You mentioned, and to me this seems relevant, that the whole town after these children drowned, I mean, there was a funeral and people came in, you know, from Chicago, relatives and whatnot.
It was an awful tragedy. It was like this recent plane crash, I think. Maybe it hit home because everybody knew the children. There was a darling little girl named Stella, and she was the most wonderful tap dancer, and she and Wallace Scott were a couple. He was a little older than she was, but they tap danced together. And they were good. They were just wonderful. They performed for school programs. And she was one of the ones that drowned. Everybody knew all these people and respected their families. Their fathers were waiters in the mess hall. And everybody knew them, and it was just heartbreaking.
So there was quite an outpouring from the town.
There was, yes, indeed there was.
And I understand if you can't give a lot of detail, but do you want to talk about the incident of the children at Rectors?
That was the time, that was the beginning of the spread of an understanding about what they called race relations in the North. And perhaps something in World War II going on might have fostered this, because men were in the service and they were mingling and traveling, and a lot of men that would have never been, maybe young men that would have never been off the farm, or going all over the world and having all kinds of experiences, and there was a lot going on, and that was the beginning of something they called race relations. And the League of Women Voters of the United States was a wonderful organization for women to understand politics and political issues and social issues pertaining to the law, voting issues and candidates. And there were a lot of people here in town from Chicago came for the funeral and to visit the families of the bereaved parents, and some of the children walked uptown to Rector's drugstore, which was probably right about there at 110 North Main, or in that vicinity. It was in that block. There were two drugstores in town, the Culver City drugstore on this side and down, and Rector's. And they walked up to Rector's, to the soda fountain, and sat up on the stools and ordered chocolate sodas. And when they got them, they were filled with salt. So much salt that one of the children was sickened by that salt. So, there was racism in Culver.
This was because they were black children.
Because they were black. That is the only reason that they got that.
And you did say, I think this is, even if you don't want to go into all the final details, I think it's really important to know that the League of Women Voters cared about that, and
they certainly did. We had people like Marie Newman, wife of J. Dick Newman, who had a big dairy farm west of town. Wonderfully respected people. Marie was a graduate of Indiana University, Phi Beta, and she made the president of Women Voters. We had Thelma Hodges, who had a degree from the University of Chicago, and her mother had worked in Culver as a maid for people in the cottages in the summer. And her father had worked at the Academy in various capacities. And Barbara Hughes, wife of an English teacher at the Academy, they had a very good nucleus of women, and they studied. I mean, they were studying, when the war ended, the Marshall Plan. I mean, they wanted to know all about everything that was going on, and they wanted to get the facts right. And they wanted to be informed voters and informed citizens. So when this happened, it hit them right between the eyes. And they wanted to do something about it. So they went to consult a lawyer to see what they could do. And they talked about it, and they talked about it. And somehow the administration at the Academy found out that the women were talking about this and wanting to do something about it. And two of the men I know were called in, perhaps others were called in. My father was called in to the superintendent's office and told to tell his wife to lay off and to not have anything more to do with these people at all, or he would not get a contract to teach in the coming year. And the other faculty member was Art Hughes, an English teacher, much younger and more easygoing, perhaps, than my father was. I mean, a little easier to get a job as an English teacher than it is a musician. Musician jobs are harder to get. And Art was told the same thing. And that's the way it was in Culver. It was a terrifying thing to have happen. And we talked, and my mother talked to Thelma Hodges. Mother liked Thelma. Thelma Hodges was in my Auntie Billy's class from Culver High School. They went all through school together. And the interesting thing and sorrowfully sad thing was that when Auntie Billy was in about the 3rd grade, I guess, and maybe they lived here in the house at 117 West Madison, she had a picnic for the whole class. Thelma was the only black girl in the class, and she wasn't invited. And I didn't know about that until about 1978. And Thelma told me that herself, and she said she had just cried and cried when she found out everybody was going to the class, to the picnic, but she wasn't invited. And I just felt sick about it too. My grandmother was always out championing injustice and social injustice and any kind of cruelty. But there was that racism thing. It was awful. And Mother said to Thelma in our living room at the house on North Terrace, how can you stand it? How can you take it? Don't you want to do something about these children being hurt? And how can they go back to Chicago and remember what happened to them and that nothing was done to avenge this injustice? And Thelma said, what was the quote I gave you? Just had a senior moment.
We do what we have to do.
We do what we have to do. We do what we have to do, which was just accept it and not be bitter and not be vengeful. It's the white people who were vengeful and bitter, not the blacks.
Thelma went on to become quite prominent.
She was. I loved her. And she knew my family. She knew my mother's family. And, of course, her mother and father knew my grandparents, the Eisenhards. And Thelma and I used to enjoy having a cup of coffee together and chatting. And she said to me, the bundle, nearly last time I saw her, someday we'll talk. Someday we'll talk. But my 2 aunts outlived her. And I think she was waiting to talk. And then she got very sick with cancer and died, and we never got to talk. I remember her very fondly.
Something you said, and not to keep harping on this general subject, but it would help me flesh out this other interview. You said during the war, maybe you could talk about this is why the waiter system changed as far as who they brought
right,
up.
Right. The first thing is, it's kind of a funny story in a way. It was funny at the time. People laughed about it. All the able-bodied men. It's 1:45 already. You have to go to lunch.
She has to go. Yeah, she's going.
All the able-bodied men, 19 years old and over, if they could see lightning and hear thunder and read and write, were marching in khaki uniforms. And the academy was left with a very big health problem, because they employed so many men as workmen. I don't know what the number of employees was, but it must have been at least half the number of students they had over there. So they, and a lot of other companies, big companies, for instance, I know in big manufacturing companies in Benton Harbor and St. Joe, Michigan, all these big companies needed workers desperately. And remember, even then women started doing all this kinds of work, Rosie the Riveter and all that. That's how desperate it was. So I'm not sure if they got these men from an employment agency or how they got them up there. They got men up from Kentucky. Some of them were as young as 18 or 19 years old. They had not been taken by the draft because they could not read and write. And they worked in the mess hall as cooks and dishwashers and cleaning positions, did floor mopping and stuff. And we used to see them walking up the road in back of the mess hall, crossing State Route 10, going up to this area that was called the shacks, and that's where they lived. And I'm not sure if the academy had built those buildings for them to live in. I suspect that they did, but I couldn't verify that. And Charles Mather's older daughter, Betty, had two daughters. Betty was the older one. Came home from college. In the interim, she, not too long after this, joined the Waves and had an interesting career in Washington. But she thought it was so terrible that these young men could not read and write that she got books and primers and tablets and had classes for them after they got off work in the mess hall and taught them to read and write. And guess what happened? They got drafted. So the academy had to find more people that couldn't read and write to come and work in the mess hall. And maybe that's when they started employing more women. I'm not sure what happened after that. But at the time, it seemed humorous. But now when I think back about the number of people in the United States in the 1940s that couldn't read and write, it's horrifying. They were in Arkansas, Kentucky, West Virginia, up in the hills, never went to school. No schooling was enforced. And so it's very sad.
So they began bringing this different crowd to be wait staff.
That's right, that's right. And they were wild, and Patty lived in the house across from the mess hall, facing the mess hall, and I lived on North Terrace, and we used to go back and forth, but never in the dark alone because of the KYs. We had to always have a father coming to meet us, don't leave the house until you hear me whistle type thing, or, I'll be right there. And so we were always escorted every place. I never heard of the KYs doing any harm, though. Jeff has just said they were rowdy. And of course they were undisciplined, and they untrained in social ways. Never heard of them hurting any girls.
KY is just referred to
Kentucky. The KYs from Kentucky.
Do you personally remember the incident or the period when you said some of them sort of snuck into the pool?
I do remember that. I do remember that. They broke into the academy swimming pool at night and went swimming, and they could not swim, and they had no lights on because they didn't want to be exposed, I guess. And one of the boys drowned and couldn't be brought up to the surface. And the way I remember, I was told about it by Betty and Patty Mather and my parents everybody talked about it. It was so sad because if they had gone for help immediately, they might have saved the boy, but they didn't turn on the lights and they didn't go for help because they were doing something they weren't supposed to do. Once again, you know, if they're bad, they get hurt. So the boy drowned. It was very sad.
I guess to just sort of close out this discussion, you talked, I don't think we filmed it, but you remembered was it your aunt when the Klan would come to town, or?
The Ku Klux Klan had marches right down Lakeshore Drive, right down the street of Main Street of Culver. And I guess the local businessmen were active in it, and they wore the white sheets or costumes and masks. They were masked. And my grandfather, George Eisenhard, this is according to Aunt Sue, would stand on the corner and watch them go by and say, "Hi, Henry," and "Hi," call them out by name because they wanted to be anonymous. And of course he didn't approve of their stance, and so he'd try to embarrass them that way. It's a wonder there wasn't retaliation. You know, there might have been some retaliation. I've always wondered why when he retired he was only a major, a wrought iron range major, when everybody else in his, all of his co-workers that were there about the same length of time as he, and can't think of a word, you know, all careers, you know, alongside each other.
His peers.
Peers were wrought iron range colonels, and he was major, and maybe it's just too outspoken. Rubs him further the wrong way. It had nothing to do with money. I know that from over the years. My father coming home kind of laughing and saying, "Well, I'm a major now, or I'm captain now, or I'm lieutenant colonel now," but didn't mean the money at all. It was no big thing. It just rank, wrought iron range rank, they used to call it.
Well, is there anything else?
Oh, I'll think of something when I get home.
Yeah, I know.
Bad.
There's plenty to...
So if I do, I'll jot it down, and if you think of anything, jot it down. There might be things that people would be interested in that I think are so commonplace I don't talk about.
I'll tell you one more thing maybe we could throw in, because I'm beginning to see the importance of this. You don't have to go into a lengthy thing, but you mentioned Dave Burns being the hero of that night. But
He was.
I'm gathering that he was kind of a local hero in many ways.
He was. In the first place, he was unusual looking, and maybe because he worked outdoors, but we were all used to people being outdoors. My own father was tanned and strong. You didn't see overweight people. You didn't see people hobbling around, and the men that worked at the academy were right out there with the students, coaching and running, and my dad, in his case, out on the parade ground with the band and constantly exercising. Dave Burns was, well, I would say that he had charisma. And he was tanned, very strong looking. I seem to remember him being kind of big around, not fat, but what would you say, burly maybe? And I'll bet it was from lifting stones. He did this beautiful stonework. And there was another person, M.R. Klein, who did beautiful stonework. And I'm not sure which ones Klein built around town, but a lot of fireplaces and stone walls were built either by Klein or Dave Burns. Is it M.R. Klein? Well, I'm not sure, but I know his name was Klein. And they were artisans in stone, and people would watch Dave Burns, and he would pick up boulders, which we're all used to seeing because of the glacial moraine that we live on. All these boulders around all the time, granite, pink, gray, with flecks of mica in them, and always so beautiful. And we just grew up with those fireplaces and stone walls in front of our houses, and we took it for granted. And Jean Epley told me one time she had been watching Dave Burns work on a wall he was building, and she said she just watched him pick up a stone and he'd turn it in his hands this way, turn it upside down and look at it, try it, fit it in. If it wasn't quite right, he'd try another one. It was a work of art. It was almost as though he was making jewelry when he built a fieldstone wall.
And he was also the fire chief.
And he was the fire chief. Now, I could verify this with Lance Overmeyer. And, you know, I'm sure that he might have a record of this at the fire station. I know that Dave Burns was a man who was very devoted to his community here and very active. If anybody needed help, he was there to help.
Okay.
It's blinking.
Yeah, I've got 5 minutes of tape left. So, you know.
Now, Wallace Scott was the only black student in my class. And Wallace was in first grade and graduated with me. And his father was a waiter in the mess hall. And Wallace, because my last name began with P and his was S, we lockered together all through high school. Our lockers were right next door to each other. And he was always just a perfect gentleman, and he dressed nicely, and was quiet and a very good student, probably a better student than I was. I just didn't care about schoolwork much. I loved English and history, but I didn't care much for anything else. And I must say, I'm talking about school, I did have a very good typing teacher, and I learned to type well, which was a way I could earn some money. And when I got out of school, I could be a typist. And but you know, Wallace was so nice, and I wondered what it must have been like for him, maybe similar for him to Thelma Scott's experience, who certainly old enough to be his mother, who was the only black girl in the 3rd grade with my aunt. Back in, let's see, Auntie was born in 1907, so this would have been about when, 1914, 1915. So then there's Wallace in about, 1935, the only black boy in the 3rd grade too, and having to live with that. I wish he was here to talk to us. He danced with Stella Simmons was her last name, Stella Simmons. And Wallace went on to study dance with a leading dance instructor, a Negro dance troupe. And this was in the late 40s, and I just can't quite think of the name of that dance troupe, but maybe it'll come to me. But he died. I saw him at the town park in the early 70s, and then not too long after that he died. But, he was the type that would, if he fell down the steps at school, which I did a couple of times, he wouldn't stand there and say, "Ho, ho, ho, Martha, I saw your underpants," or something like that, because we all wore dresses and skirts, and our notebooks and papers would fall. He would help you. He would come over and say, "Oh, I hope you're not hurt," and gather up your papers for you. There were a lot of rude, crude boys at school. Very rude and crude. I suppose there still are. There were some very nice ones, too. And Wallace was one of them.